great pleasure to be here today, and it's a great pleasure for the Tata-Cornell Institute to co-host this consultation with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. I was always worried about being too provocative, but Professor Roy started the game today by setting the bar on provocation quite high. So that means we can be very open and very free in our discussions as we go through this morning. I'm really happy about that. Let me start by talking about where we are in terms of food and agriculture and nutrition policy in India today. And as I start that, I'd like you to go back to the 1950s, the 1960s. And if you think about the 1950s and 60s, we were talking about a time when India was desperately deficit in food. And India was desperately deficit in absolute quantities of staple food. And so what was done in terms of agriculture policy at that time was absolutely correct in terms of enhancing overall productivity of staples. We can argue at the margin whether the balance of the big three versus the rest was right or wrong, but the strategy that we needed to increase the pile of staple grains in order to feed the millions that were hungry and to bring food prices down and to use overall food productivity as a way for generating farm incomes and farm productivity growth and therefore create structural transformation, which all happened, was an absolutely right strategy. I think what we need to do is not get still caught up in that 1960s, 1970s paradigm of just keeping to increasing staple grain quantity improvements and staple grain productivity improvements, but rather look beyond that and look beyond towards what are the nutritional needs today, what's the diet demand today, and is food and agriculture policy meeting that? And that's where we need to be having this discussion, and this discussion has been going on within various communities here in India and certainly across the world. There's a recent paper that I wrote with Pastor Nita and Andali Rahman called The Bumpy Road from Food to Nutrition Security. And that paper actually talks through the political economy process that we are facing in making this transition. Now, where is the transition required? So as you think about what are the challenges that the food system is facing, the big challenges we have is there is a strong and palpable rise in demand for diversity. The demand for diversity is very clear, and it's happening with income growth, with urbanization, etc. And I think that's part of what we need to be looking at. But at the same time, we need to be proactively looking at how do you create food system diversity in order to promote more nutrition. So how do you create food system diversity that directly contributes to reducing micronutrient malnutrition, improving protein access, etc., so that you can address the chronic problems of childhood stunting, underweight, wasting, etc. So here you're going away from thinking about nutrition outcomes purely from a hunger reduction point of view to nutrition outcomes that explicitly address the hidden hunger issues of micronutrient malnutrition and the outcomes of stunting and wasting, etc. And the third aspect of the change that's needed is not just to provide diversity in the food system, but to make that diversity affordable. Because it's not enough that the upper middle class populations living in Delhi and Mumbai have diversity, but we would like to see that rural populations in Gorakhpur have similar access to diversity as to urban middle class populations. So that's the challenge in terms of making the food system more affordable as well as nutritious. And the last point here is that while there are various safety net programs and nutrition-based safety net programs, PBS is one of them, ICDS, midday meal programs, etc. None of these programs actually converge towards explicitly bringing about change in overall nutrition outcomes. So addressing these safety net programs relative to broader nutrition outcomes, such as child stunting, and designing these programs that they interact with each other and get to that outcome is a challenge that's out there, and I don't believe that we've made enough progress in getting to that. So let me give you a little bit more detail on some of these issues. I think the striking issue for us is that the demand for diversity is rising very, very rapidly across India. And this graph is slightly misleading because it shows you on the supply side on what an average Indian diet is beginning to look like. An average Indian diet essentially, which was extremely stable grain focused, over time you're beginning to see the number of food groups consumed decreasing and the share of the non-staple part of the food groups rising over time. Both in terms of overall calories, but also in terms of quality characteristics, etc. that are changing. And why is this happening? Much of this is happening with income growth, but also with rapid urbanization and globalization, leading to diet changes, diet homogenization, etc. that's happening. But what this is tripping towards is diet diversity moving towards more processed foods, especially as time pressures increase, as the demand for convenience increases, etc. And because the relative prices of non-staples, fruits, vegetables, meat, etc., continue to be high, while the demand for this non-staples is rising, the extent to which this is being operationalized in terms of daily consumption is limited because of the relative price differences. And the fact that supply response hasn't kept up with the rising demand, that you still see these relative prices high, and that constraining a switch to a more diverse diet, especially among the lower middle class and poorer population. So that's an issue that we need to be thinking about. Okay? So I can lock myself with this system. So next, let's look at some of the emerging nutrition challenges, or the persistent and emerging nutrition challenges. We've all worked on hunger issues for decades. And I think we've made tremendous progress on hunger reduction. Of course, there's still hunger. One doesn't deny that we still have hunger in this country. But imagine what the hunger situation would have been if we did not go through the Green Revolution process, if we did not go through the massive increase in overall staple grain production. But even as we've addressed the hunger problem, we haven't been able to bring about a big change in the overall malnutrition problem. And malnutrition manifested primarily here in terms of childhood stunting and childhood underweight, wasting, etc. And most of you have seen the latest NIPFP data. The latest NIPFP data emphasizes the fact that while we've made some progress, that progress hasn't been adequate to move the needle significantly on child stunting and wasting. And these graphs, these maps here, use that NIPFP data to show progress by district across the country. And you see the red and the orange are areas with much higher incidence of stunting and malnutrition. And 50% or higher in the case of red, 40% or higher in the case of orange. And you'll see that the higher incidence of childhood malnutrition is becoming increasingly concentrated. It's becoming increasingly concentrated in the central and the eastern parts of the country, in the northeastern parts, the sort of Indo-Gangetic plain areas, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, etc. from Madhya Pradesh happens. So that concentration is happening much more so than it was in the past. And over time, the southern states and the western states, etc., are seeing significant improvement. But even there, one can see the need for dramatic progress that needs to be made. Further progress, further rapid shift in reducing the problem of child starvation. And we haven't made as much progress as we should be, and comparable to countries at similar levels of economic growth, we have not seen as much progress happening. So one needs to bring this back into the picture of food systems and food system change. Now, I want to share with you my favorite slide, and I don't know if you can see this clearly. And this slide shows you the other emerging problem that we're beginning to see in India. The other emerging problem is rising obesity trends. So if you look at the vertical axis, you see the percentage of overweight adults. And the horizontal, you see the percentage of underweight children. And what we did was to plot states relative to the share of overweight and underweight populations. And you'll notice that the upper left-hand side, etc., are the richer states of India. And in the richer states of India, you begin to see the pendulum shifting from underweight populations to increasingly overweight populations. And in the poorer states of India, in the Bimaru states of India, you're still grappling with the chronic problem of malnutrition, child malnutrition, underweight, and the overweight incidence is much lower. But that challenge that you see today of food policy, of not just addressing undernutrition and malnutrition, but looking at malnutrition in terms of also rising problems of obesity and the rising problems of non-communicable diseases, is a significant challenge that we're just beginning to talk about in this country. There's a lot more we need to do in addressing this problem. In my view, the solution to undernutrition and the solution to overnutrition are the same. The solution is better access to more affordable diversity in the food system. The more affordable nutritious food is, the easier it is to tackle undernutrition, and the easier it is to tackle overnutrition. Because then, from an overnutrition point of view, fresh food becomes more competitive relative to processed food. And so you begin to see that substitution. And even for the poorer populations who are transitioning faster into processed food, as fresh, nutritious food becomes more accessible and more affordable, that transition becomes smaller and slow. So that challenge for over and undernutrition needs to be addressed through a food system that's more nutritious, more affordable, and more accessible. So then the question is, so how do we do that? Now we know that the demand for that diversity is increasing. We know that from a consumer level, the more diversity that's available in the market, it's better for them. And there's a strong demand for increasing the share of different food groups within the daily diet. So the question that comes up for an economist is, if that demand is there, why is the supply response so poor? Why are small farmers not responding to this demand and increasing the supply of diversity in the food system? And that's been something that we've been looking at for quite a while. But before I answer that question, I want to show you what's been happening to per capita food availability in India. If you look across time, India has done tremendously well in keeping up overall per capita food grain supply above population growth. Okay, that's been one of the success stories of India. And this graph shows you that very clearly. But it also shows you that increase in food grain supply has been primarily coming from the big states. But if you look at coarse cereals, millets, etc., there's been a gradual decline. If you look at pulses, there's been a gradual decline over time. And this is despite the recent attention to pulses. And there's some of the data from the budgets discussion will show you this from a budget point of view. So there's been this gradual decline in overall pulse per capita availability of pulses also. So these two, pulses, coarse cereals, and some of the other nutritious foods, haven't kept up with population growth rate. The supply of these foods hasn't kept up with population growth rate, whereas staples have more than kept up with population growth rate. So that comes back to the question of why has supply response been so low for the non-staples? And I think one of the main reasons why the supply response has been so low is because there's been a definite policy bias towards staples. Now, as I said earlier on, at the time of the Green Revolution, that was the right thing to do. And I'm the last person to argue against that. I've actually written a lot about why that was the right thing to do. But then one needs to say, how do we get beyond that? And that's where we're stuck. And we're stuck because of the persistence of a set of Green Revolution policies that continue to be extremely important in agriculture policy today. Price supports, input credit subsidies, irrigation infrastructure support that's given primarily for staple grains, and the R&D which is primarily focused on staple grains. So the entire agriculture system is geared towards a policy that's extremely biased towards enhancing staple grain supplies, and pretty much it, and not so much looking beyond that. And the budget discussion, which will come up in a few minutes, reinforces some of that points. Second, if you want to improve supplies of fresh food, more nutritious food, one needs to look at rural markets. Rural markets are the conduit both for supply of that food but also for access to that food for poor rural populations. And rural market infrastructure continues to be extremely poor when you think about perishable products. Cold storage systems, transport systems that are refrigerated, communication systems, etc. All of that. The third big challenge has been that while the extension systems in India have focused on improving staples, there hasn't been adequate extensions looking beyond staples. And the skill requirements, the knowledge requirements, etc. for vegetable production, horticulture production, etc. are extremely different and much more knowledge intensive. And we haven't made that transition as much. And finally, the transactions cost for smallholders to connect into the market, connect into the value chain, are very, very high. And we haven't created a system for reducing those transactions costs in the same way as the procurement systems are doing for staples. In the case of the staples, the overall procurement systems have come in and dramatically reduced transactions costs for smallholders. We haven't done the same when you look beyond the staples. So, what we would argue for is thinking about redesigning food policy for nutrition security. And the way one would redesign that food policy is to continue being focused on agriculture. We're not suggesting that you remove the focus on agriculture. You continue being focused on agriculture, but with an emphasis on diversification to a more broader set of commodities and more nutritious crops and livestock products. And second, given that the increased concentration of rural poverty, increased concentration of malnutrition is in Eastern India. One needs to look at agriculture-focused growth in Eastern India. But then learning from the lessons that we had from the past, trying to make that growth not so connected to just staple grain growth, but rather to look at growth through pulse production, so vegetable production, horticulture production, coarse grain production, etc. And then looking at ways to connect smallholders to value chains for horticulture and livestock products. A lot of interesting work going on producer organizations, etc. But all of these seem to be spotty activities. There seems to be no clear pathway to scaling up these sorts of small pilots around aggregation of smallholders to reduce transaction costs. And is there a way to make that happen, and happen in a big way, connecting urban consumers and rural producers through these value chains, which allows you to improve access for poor consumers both in urban and rural areas, and certainly bring down the relative prices of the non-staple crops. Then the next point comes down to this whole area of intersectoral and interdepartmental convergence. I think there's a lot that's happening today in terms of safety net program, and the budget discussion will show you the enormous amounts of money that are going into subsidy programs. But there's no clear pathway for linking those safety net programs to nutrition outcomes. Even when they're explicitly meant to create nutrition outcomes, those pathways are not clear. And convergence between these programs to enhance the prospects of reducing malnutrition are not very clear. For example, convergence between ICDS, PDS, midday meal schemes, etc. Even if just getting those three together and creating an explicit pathway from those programs to nutrition outcomes could have enormous long-term benefits. And finally, an issue that I think should be on the table is to think long-term whether we need to transition from a food-based subsidy program towards a cash-based cash transfer program. And I think, as an economist, I think that's a great idea. But I would suspect many nutritionists may also think that once you have market systems in place, once you have food system diversity in place, then providing the ability for people to be able to buy the diversity that they demand could be the new way to move forward. But that's a debate that we all need to have. So let me stop there. And for those of you who would like to look more about the type of work that the Tata-Cornell Institute is doing and some of our publications, the data, etc., please feel free to visit our website. And also you can follow us on Twitter, and you can see some of the work